Hey guys, so it had occurred to me recently after watching an empiricist lecture, the relationship of power to will, or to put it more aptly, of power to the self. Now, this is in regard to the process of temporality and its fleeting effect on consciousness. So, that time, as it's coordinated in a perceptual sphere of locality where one finds themselves at any given time, is a form of self becoming, uh, whether someone's aware of it or not. In the lecture, the point was made that experiences that happen to us are unchangeable and fixed, they're permanent. But this isn't accurate because simply because we cannot impose a change in how an event played out, that the limitations of our will can't, literally alter how it happened. It doesn't deny how it's still subjected to chaos and how an experience changes within consciousness and memory over time in relation to the self in flux. This is a point of view that has some nihilistic tendencies, which I'll get into. Now, the awareness of this self becoming, it produces, of course, suffering and anxiety. And the subconscious knowledge that we have of ourselves as fleeting in this perceptual spectrum of time. So, time not only has a representation of change, but also the sensory experience of the self in change. So this self being the dying process, entropy. And so how power relates to this process of temporal decay, we'll call it, to a manifestation of how the identity is formed and the kind of actions that it demands on the individual for either the survivability or the enhancement of its own being. And so it's evident that this perceptual experience of dying, of decay, which is the abstraction of the physical decay that's actually occurring. It's going to produce a type of personality, a mind, or an attitude that will choose to direct the inevitability of this fleeting self into either a creative or destructive impulse. That is, the ability to reform oneself out of this entropic process to overcome, as opposed to succumbing to it through total submission to its inevitable outcome, which is death. And this would be nihilism, right? And so there's a median point, though. There's a middle point, which is spiritual lethargy, idleness. The lack of drive, the lack of any will to live or die. And existential passivity, a kind of unserious outlook on life. And it makes me think about an engraving called Melancholia by Albert Dürer. And it makes me think about how the mind is drawn towards its own inherent fate of death, like how the mind orients itself against its own will to the meaninglessness of existence, and how it's in constant conflict with this meaninglessness, even though it's surrounded by every resource of creative possibility. It's encumbered by this need to create. It's encumbered by its own self, its own will, because this need to create, in effect, it places a demand of a personal duty on the individual to become something. There is an undeniable demand that is placed on the individual to create themselves and find a way to arrest this dying process through the exertion of their own power. Now, because this dying process, this sensory experience of self fleeting, it can allow for a kind of intensity of purpose towards a becoming, that because you feel yourself dying, or that you recognize the meaninglessness of existence, that this will create an extreme of the self that will use the urgency of this loss of self and transmute it into an impetus for power. And this is a very masculine drive. The male drive to overcome its own expendability through its, procreative fitness, which is just another way to create itself. You know, the biological creation of self is really what it is. And the male is driven by its awareness of its own biological expendability and short termness, in terms of relating to animals in this sense. And this is what gives the male and the masculine, in the archetypal way, this creative niche to invent and focus itself towards dominating something. And so I think about the psychological dynamic of the power process in this respect in the movie Fight Club, right? And so you have the duality of the self, right? One side represented by the passive protagonist ego, which is the Jack narrator, and the other represented by the active alter ego, which is the Tyler Durden. And so we have one side of this dual self, which is representative of the modern mentality, the passive idol side, the side that romanticizes power and strength, but doesn't actually have the ability to possess it or tap into it themselves or to know how to manage it. And, in the movie, the Jack narrator, the feminized ego, he goes about the creation of himself in this Durden alter ego in a kind of nonchalant, oblivious way. He's totally naive and childish. For him, he doesn't actually want to take on the duty, the responsibility that comes with possessing power, of exerting it, because that would mean he would have to become inventive and creative, and he would have to actually commit to something greater than himself and embrace the consequences of that. And this is what Durden tries to get him to understand, that power has to lead to something. It has a purpose. It has to actually strive towards an objective goal. It has to have a direction to dominate something. And in Durden's case, he's completely and fully aware of his own power to the point where he uses it to dominate and control everything. Because the nature of power in itself is actually to do just that, to dominate and annex more of oneself in the process of dying. Now, this is why power has to do with domination over oneself, in Nietzsche's sense, that the parts of oneself that are being lost in time are being preserved and built back up again. This is what power really means, right? But the Jack ego, he goes about this situation completely oblivious to what the hell is even happening or what it means. Like he's a naive child or a moron. He thinks that Fight Club was supposed to be some harmless, trivial pastime that he used here and there just to get his jollies off with pent-up aggression and nothing more. Like it was some kind of a game that he could just enjoy for a short time and then forget about it. And so when he sees Durden, who is completely and totally serious and not fucking around, and is actually intending to take it towards an act of creation, towards self-actualization, to a logical conclusion of dominance, he's completely frightened by it. He doesn't understand it. He's clueless to the reality that power has to have a function out of possession, and that this is exactly what the modern mind wants from power. It only wants to possess it, but it doesn't want to use it to become anything. That's why they romanticize it, because they only like the idea of it, as they can use it to shapeshift their own identity. to whatever facade of power they want to create for themselves, only in mind, but not in actuality. So, this is why power has to be pagan, because it has to be active, of what can actually become real in the sense of self creation, what can actually be accomplished in the objective realm, and why power, that is, real power, frightens the modern mind. Because it not only demands that one take on the duty to use it toward a purpose, but to accept the unforgiving nature of it, to destroy what gets in its way. The modern only wants creation, not destruction. It doesn't want what's scary, what's bad, but it lusts after destruction. And that's why it has this love affair, with life, not death, because it doesn't think about what death could offer, in terms of the negative exigency. Because death is exactly what's out of balance in their existence. And what's out of balance, will always end up being what comes around to exact its own revenge.